Abena's family was filled with jubilation when she finally agreed to marry Mr. Akwa. The weight of their years of struggle seems to vanish overnight, replaced with the sparkling possibility of a new life. Her father, who hardly smiled, now beamed with a sense of relief, his hard expression softened by the hope of wealth and comfort. "We will be fine now, Abena," he told her, his voice marked with disbelief, as if the promise of a better future was something he do only dream of. Her mother's tears, glistering in her eyes, held Abena's hands tightly, her joy overflowing. "This is the right choice, my child," she whispered, as if confirming a prayer answered. "We are going to have a future finally," she said. Preparations for the wedding began in a rush. The house was filled with the bustle of activities, dresses being sewn, food being prepared, and decoration going up. Abena's parents proudly paraded their new clothes, their face full of pride as the villagers came by to congratulate them. The village bustled with excitement, and Abena couldn't help but feel the weight of everyone's gazes on her. As she watched her family's happiness, a knot formed in her stomach. The joy around her didn't ease the unease that continued to nag at her heart. She couldn't help but feel like something was off, like she was walking into a life that wasn't truly hers to claim. Still, the weight of her decision pressed heavily on her, and there was no turning back now. 2 days before the wedding, just as preparation reached their peak, an unexpected visitor arrived, a pastor. His entrance was quiet but unsettling. Draped in simple robes, he looked out of place in the commotion of wedding plans. He made his way into the room, his presence commanding attention without saying a word. The villagers fell silent as he spoke, his voice low but steady. "I don't know who you are," he began, "but I have come with a message from God." Abena froze. She had heard of pastors coming with words of prophecy, but nothing prepared her for what he had to say. "There is a man coming to seek your daughter's hand in marriage. Do not give her to that man." His words hung in the air, heavy and threatening, and just as suddenly as he appeared, he left, vanishing into the distance without another word. Abena's heart raced as she rushed to her father, barely able to contain her trembling hands. "Papa, Papa, did you hear that?" she asked urgently. "The pastor said not to marry Mr. Akwa. What if God is trying to tell us something?" Her father turned to face her, his brow furrowed with frustration. "Don't you get it, Abena?" he snapped. "That man is a fake man of God. Who doesn't know that you're getting married in this village? So God didn't show him anything. He is fake. Maybe he was sent by our enemies that want to ruin us, that doesn't want you to marry into a wealthy family. People are jealous of what you are about to have. Don't let them turn your mind against this marriage." Abena felt her heart sink. She didn't know what to believe anymore. "But what if he's right?" she whispered. "What if this is a sign?" Her father's face reddened with anger. "A sign? You are looking for any excuse not to marry him, aren't you?" he said, stepping closer to her. "You have already agreed to this marriage, and now you are going to back out. Think about what this means for us, Abena. Think about what we have gone through. This is the best thing that has ever happened to us. Do you really think we should let it slip away just because of some strange man's word?" Abena's heart ached with every word he spoke, the pressure mounting inside her. She knew he was right in some ways. The promises of wealth, the life of comfort that seemed so close, but was it worth the cost? Her mind and heart were at war. The wedding day arrived, and the village was alive with excitement. Abena stood at the center of the celebration, smiling for the villagers, but inside, she was a hollow shell. The music and laughter surrounded her, but they felt distant, as if she was watching someone else's life unfold. The villagers praised her beauty, showering her with admiration and envy, but Abena couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider in her own life. Her parents were glowing with pride, their faces full of the joy they had long dreamed of. But Abena's mind kept drifting back to the pastor's warning and to Kofi, the love she had lost. She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. The next morning, after the wedding, Mr. Akwa arrived to take Abena to the city. Her parents stood at the gates, waving eagerly, their faces a mixture of joy and finality. As Abena stepped into the car, her father approached Mr. Akwa, his expression hopeful. "When will you fulfill your promises?" he asked eagerly. "You said you do build us a house. You do send us money. When will you do that?" Mr. Akwa smiled, his eyes gleaming with a calculated promise. "After 3 months, I will make it all happen," he said smoothly. "Let me enjoy my honeymoon with my new wife first. But don't worry, I will take care of everything. You will get everything I promised." Abena sat quietly in the car, her heart racing. She didn't know what to think anymore. Her family's hope rested in Mr. Aqua's hands, and it felt like the future was slipping away before she could even understand it. As the car drove away from the village, Abena stared out the window, her thoughts cycling. The landscape outside seemed foreign to her, the roads leading to an unknown future. The city loomed ahead, but it felt like an insurmountable distance away. She thought of Kofi, the love she had once cherished, and the life she had left behind. The weight of the decision she had made pressed down on her chest. How had she ended up here? How had she come to this point where everything seems uncertain and unreal? Her hands trembled as she gripped the seat, her thoughts racing, but there was no turning back now. Back in the village, the days dragged on. Abena's parents waited eagerly for the promises to be fulfilled. But as the weeks turned into months, doubt began to creep in. They tried calling Mr. Akwa, but his phone was always out of service. They had heard nothing from Abena. The silence grew unbearable. Her mother could spend hours staring out of the window, waiting for a letter, a phone call, anything to reassure her that their daughter was all right. "What if he's forgotten us?" her father said one evening, his voice ringing with panic. "What if we have been tricked?" The months passed in painful quiet. Abena's parents grew anxious, their hopes dimming with each unanswered call. They had put all their faith in Mr. Aqua's promises, but now it seems as though their trust has been misplaced. Her father's frustration grew with each passing day. He couldn't understand why nothing had changed. He had been promised a new life, a life of wealth, a life of luxuries, but it seems more like a distant dream now. His hand shook as he tried calling Mr. Aqua again, but the phone went unanswered. The weight of their disappointment was too much to bear. As the silence continued, Abena's parents began to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. The promises that had once seemed so certain now felt like lies. Their dreams of a better life, seems further away than ever before. They haven't heard from Abena, and with each passing day, the fear grew that they might never see her again. The realization settled in that the man who had seemed so promising, so reliable, might not be what he appeared to be. The truth was beginning to slip away from them, and they feared the worst. With a sense of mounting dread, Abena's parents are left in limbo, waiting for news that will never come, and the promises of a better life fade into uncertainty. The mystery of Mr. Akwa's true intentions hangs heavily in the air, and the family's hope seems to be slipping further out of reach. What began as a joyous celebration now felt like a distant memory, and the looming sense of betrayal and unanswered questions leaves everyone feeling vulnerable and uncertain about what the future holds. The months stretched nearly into a year, and still there was no word from Abena. At first, her parents tried to silence their worries, convincing themselves that she was simply adjusting to her new life in the city. After all, wasn't she married to a wealthy man? Surely she was too busy enjoying her fortune to remember the village. But deep inside, unease crawled at their hearts. Mr. Aqua's number remained unreachable. The promised wealth never arrived. Each time they asked around, the villagers had different answers, some whispering that Abena was living like a queen, while others hinted at something more sinister. Has anyone actually seen her? One old woman murmured. Or are we only hearing what we want to hear? The question sent chills down Abena's mother's spine, but she refused to believe anything was wrong. They had made the right choice, haven't they? Far away from the village, Abena stepped into what seems like paradise. A towering mansion with white marble floors and glittering chandeliers. The vast hallways were lined with expensive paintings, and each room was adorned with velvet curtains and golden furnitures. But despite its beauty, the house felt strangely empty. There were no maids bustling about, no laughter or warmth, only an eerie silence that seemed to stretch through every corner. When she asked Mr. Akwa why the house was so quiet, he merely smiled and said, "This is a home for peace, not chaos." His words did nothing to comfort her, neither did his next revelation. "You must never leave this house, Abena. The city is dangerous. There are people who would wish you harm." She wanted to argue, but the way he said it, the way his dark eyes seemed to see straight through her, made her swallow her words. At first, she tried to ignore her growing discomfort. The food was luxurious, the clothes he provided were beautiful, and she wanted to believe she could be happy. But days passed, then weeks, and Mr. Akwa barely spoke to her. He would leave in the morning and return late at night, going straight to his study room, locking the door behind him. When she knocked, there was no answer. When she called for him, he acted as if he didn't hear. And though she had been prepared for her duties as his wife, Mr. Akwa never touched her, not once. At first, she was relieved, but soon the absence of his presence became more terrifying than the alternative. If he didn't want her as his wife, then why had he married her? She thought. It was the little things that unsettled her the most. The fact that there were no mirrors in the house, as if her own reflection was forbidden. The way the windows, though large and magnificent, never seemed to let in any fresh air. And then there was the door at the end of the hall, always locked, no matter the time of the day. She tried to push the unease away, telling herself she was imagining things, but the nights were the worst. Sometimes she heard a low humming, like a chant echoing through the halls. Other times, it was the scent of a thick, cloying incense that left her dizzy and lightheaded, as if the air itself was drugging her. She thought of her parents, of Kofi, of the life she had left behind. Was this really the fate she had chosen? One night, as she lay in bed, the whisper was broken by a voice. Abena. It was soft but faint, cutting through the air like a whisper against her ear. She turned, her heart pounding, as she saw Mr. Akwa standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, his silhouette dark against the candlelight. "Come," he said, "I have something to show you." She hesitated, but something in his voice, something almost hypnotic, made her rise. She followed him down the long hallway, past the cold painting and the flickering candles, until they reached the door that had always been locked. Tonight it was open. The moment she stepped inside, the scent hit her first. Thick, metallic, and unmistakably blood. Her stomach twisted as she took in the room before her. Strange symbols, drawn in blood, covered the walls. Dark candles flickered at the edges of the room, casting monstrous shadows that danced like living creatures. In the center, a large circle was carved into the marble floors, the pattern twisting in an unnatural shapes. The air felt wrong, as if the walls themselves were breathing. She took a step back, but before she could turn, something heavy crashed against the back of her skull. Pain exploded through her head, and the world went black. When she woke up, she was lying in the center of the circle. Her hands and feet were bound with thick ropes, and her body was wrapped in a red wrapper, the fabric cold against her skin. Her heart pounded wildly as she struggled, but the binds only tightened. The room was no longer empty. Hooded figures stood around her, their faces hidden beneath dark robes. They whispered in a language she didn't understand, their voices merging into a sinister chant. The world seemed to shift, pausing with every beat of her heart. She turned her head, and there he was, Mr. Akwa, standing at the head of the circle, his eyes cold and void of anything human. His lips moved in a slow, deliberate murmur, as if calling something, summoning something. A deep, guttural voice filled the room, but it did not come from any of the figure. It came from nowhere. It came from everywhere. The sacrifice is ready. The words were like a growl, vibrating through the air and into her very bone. A gust of wind rushed through the room, though there were no windows. The candles flickered violently, the shadows stretching unnaturally. Abena screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the chanting. Mr. Aqua stepped forward, a gleaming blade in his hand. It was curved, sharp, its edges reflecting the dim light. He raised it high above his head, his expression eerily calm, almost reverent. "Do not be afraid," he murmured. "Your sacrifice will not be in vain." Abena thrashed, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. This was it. This was why he had married her. Abena's body trembled, the ropes biting into her skin as she struggled in vain against her restraints. Her cries filled the dark chamber, desperate and pleading. "Please leave me alone. I don't want to do this," she begged, her voice ragged. Her eyes were wide with terror as she stared at Mr. Akwa standing over her, his twisted grin stretching unnaturally across his face. "Please don't do this to me. I beg you. I don't want your money. Just send me back to my family." But his cold laugh echoed through the room, chilling her to the bone. "You think you have a choice?" he sneered, the malice in his voice unmistakable. "You and your family took my money. Now you will pay the price." The words hung in the air, heavy with the finality of her fate. Mr. Aqua's hand rose slowly, and in it he held the gleaming blade. The metal caught the flickering candlelight, making it seem alive and hungry. With a deliberate motion, he dragged the sharp edges across Abena's skin, the deep cuts burning as it tore through her flesh. Her scream filled the air, raw and filled with agony. Warm blood spilled from the wound, pulling onto the cold floor, soaking into the ritual circle. The air around her grew thick, heavy with a seeking energy. Each drop of blood that touched the ground seemed to feed the dark power that surrounded them. Mr. Aqua's voice began to rise in incantations, low and unnatural, echoing off the walls. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist in response, like living creatures watching her every move. Abena gasped for air, the pain overwhelming her senses. "Why are you doing this to me?" she choked out, the tears streaming down her face. She could barely speak, the world blurring around her, but still she had to know. Her body trembled uncontrollably as Mr. Aqua leaned in closer, his cold breath brushing against her ear. "Do you think I married you because you are beautiful?" he whispered, his voice filled with cruel amusement. "Do you think I married you because I love you?" His chuckle was dark, mocking. "I never loved you. You are a sacrifice. This is what you came here for, and you must fulfill it." The words cut deeper than the blade ever could. She wasn't a wife. She was a pawn, a tool for his greed. As the ritual continued, Abena's vision began to fade. The sharp pain that had consumed her seemed to numb, replaced by a strange, overwhelming fatigue. Her body felt heavy, as though it no longer belonged to her. She tried to focus, but the room began to spin, and then, through the haze of pain, she saw them, figures, pale and ghostly, hovering in the shadows. Their eyes were hollow, vacant, their bodies marked with the same ritual scar that now matches her own. Their voices, soft and haunting, whispered in unison, "3 years, 3 years, 3 years." Each repetition echoed in her mind, sending waves of dread through her chest. These were the spirits of the women before her, Mr. Aqua's previous wives, each one sacrificed for his insatiable greed. Abena's heart pounded as she realized the truth. They had been here just like her. They had suffered just like her. Their faces twisted in sorrow as their eyes locked onto hers. She could feel their pain, their regret. "Run," one of them whispered, her voice barely hearable. "Run before it's too late." The whisper was filled with an urgency that sent a cold shiver down Abena's spine. But how? She was trapped. There was no way to run. The walls seemed to close in around her as the ritual continued, the shadows in the room growing darker, more menacing. Back in the village, Abena's family was falling apart. Her father, once strong and proud, had begun to weaken. His health had worsened rapidly since Abena's disappearance, and the burden of their grief and confusion weighed heavily on him. His frame, once muscular and full of life, was now frail and trembling. Her mother, unable to stand the silence any longer, made the painful decision to travel to the city in search of her daughter. She clutched the address Mr. Akwa had given them, her last hope, she believed, despite everything, that she would find her daughter living in luxury. But when she arrived, the address led her to nothing. There was no mansion, no lavish house. It was a dead end. The address was fake. Confused and heartbroken, Abena's mother searched desperately, asking anyone she met if they knew a man named Mr. Akwa, but no one recognized the name. The city was large, and the street seemed endless. She wandered through the bustling crowd, calling his name, hoping someone would know where he was, but it was as if he had never existed. No one could help her. No one knew him. Realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had no picture of him. Mr. Akwa had refused to take any wedding photos. There was no proof he ever existed. No record of the man who had promised her daughter a better life. It was like he had erased himself from their world completely. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of Abena. Her mother returned to the village, empty-handed, her heart heavy with defeat. She was exhausted, drained from the hopeless search. The weight of loss hung over her like a thick fog. Her husband's condition worsened, and the one strong man who had always been the pillar of their family now lay bedridden, weak and frail. Abena's mother could do nothing but sit at his side, her own strength fading with each passing day. The villagers began to talk. The promises of wealth, of a better life, had turned out to be nothing but lies. The house, the cars, the riches, they were all just empty lies. The villagers had waited for something that would never come, and now they whispered in hushed tones, their faces filled with pity. "It's all a lie," one of them muttered. "They are just as poor as before." Abena's family, once full of hope, now lived in poverty, far worse than they had before. They had traded their daughter's life for empty promises, and now they had lost everything. As the days passed, the truth became undeniable. Abena was gone. The man who had taken her from them was a shadow, a ghost with no face, no trace. And the family she had left behind, once proud and hopeful, now lived in the shadow of despair. Their dreams were shattered, their spirits broken. The price of blood had been paid, but the cost was far greater than what they had ever imagined.